Mom, did you like the nursery we set up? Daniel asked, his voice light, almost casual, like he was talking about a new couch or a fresh coat of paint, and I remember standing there in my kitchen, my hand still wrapped around a ceramic mug that had gone cold minutes ago, staring at him as if he had just spoken a language I didn't understand, because the truth was, I didn't, not in that moment, not when my heart skipped in confusion and something quiet but sharp began to unfold in my chest. What nursery? I asked, and the silence that followed didn't feel empty, it felt heavy, like the air itself had thickened around us, and for just a second, just 1 second, I saw it, the flicker in Emily's eyes, the way her smile froze a little too long before she looked away, adjusting the sleeve of her sweater as if that small motion could hide something much bigger. I didn't say anything else, I didn't need to, because in that pause, in that strange, misplaced question, something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to make me realize that whatever I thought I knew about the past few months might not be the full story. 2 months earlier, I had been sitting at this same kitchen table, sunlight pouring through the window, when Daniel walked in with that expression I hadn't seen since he was a boy, nervous excitement barely contained, and when he said, "Mom, Emily's pregnant with twins," I felt something inside me bloom so suddenly it almost hurt, a warmth that spread from my chest to my fingertips, and before I knew it, I was already on my feet, already hugging him, already imagining 2 tiny cribs, 2 sets of blankets, 2 little lives that would fill the quiet spaces my home had carried since my husband passed. I had always believed that family was something you built, something you invested in, not just emotionally but practically, and that day without hesitation, I made a decision that felt as natural as breathing. I told Daniel, "You're going to need more space." And within a week, I had written a check for $600,000, every dollar coming from savings I had built over decades, careful choices, quiet sacrifices, and a life lived with more discipline than indulgence. I remember walking through that house with them, hardwood floors gleaming under soft lighting, the wide windows overlooking a quiet suburban street, and Emily standing beside me, one hand resting gently on her stomach, smiling in a way that seemed almost picture-perfect, and I thought, this is what it's all been for. This is why I saved, why I planned, why I went without things I could have easily afforded, because moments like this is what mattered. We talked about turning the upstairs room into a nursery, Daniel pointing out where the cribs would go, Emily mentioning soft colors, something neutral, something calming, and I nodded along, already imagining the soft hum of a baby monitor, the quiet rhythm of rocking chairs, the kind of life that feels full without needing to be loud. But looking back now, there were things, small things, that didn't quite settle the way they should have, details that slipped past me at the time because I didn't have a reason to question them, like how Emily always changed the subject when I asked about doctor visits, or how there were never any ultrasound photos on the fridge, not even casually mentioned, not even once, and I told myself everyone is different, not everyone shares everything, and besides, trust isn't something you measure in documents or proof, it's something you give, especially to your own family. But standing there in my kitchen hearing that question about a nursery I had never seen, never been invited to, never even discussed beyond those early conversations, I felt that trust shift into something else, something quieter and far more cautious, and I noticed how Daniel avoided my eyes now, how his hand moved instinctively toward his pocket like he needed something to hold on to, while Emily remained just slightly turned away, her posture composed, her expression carefully neutral, and in that moment, I understood something without needing anyone to say it out loud. There was a part of this story that had been written without me, a version of events I hadn't been allowed to see, and for the first time since I had signed that check, since I had handed over what I believed was a gift for their future, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't been part of the future they were planning at all. That night, after they left, I did not turn on the television, I did not call anyone, and I did not even finish the cup of tea that had long gone cold on the kitchen counter. Instead I sat there in the quiet, listening to the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, a sound I had never really noticed before, and I tried to replay every moment from the past 2 months as carefully as I could, not looking for something dramatic, not searching for a clear betrayal, but for the small things, the details that had felt ordinary at the time yet now seemed to carry a different weight. I remembered how quickly everything had moved after that announcement, how Daniel had insisted that the house needed to be secured right away because with twins timing matters, and I had agreed without hesitation because that is what you do for your children. You step in when they need stability, you become the foundation they can build on, and I had always been proud of being that kind of mother, the kind who made things easier, not harder. I remembered the day we signed the paperwork, the way the realtor had smiled politely as she slid the documents across the table, explaining each line in a calm, professional tone, and how I had not asked nearly as many questions as I normally would have because Daniel was there, because Emily was there, and because trust once established over a lifetime does not feel like something that needs to be verified. But now, sitting alone, I found myself thinking about that moment differently, about how Daniel had answered most of the questions on my behalf, about how Emily had remained unusually quiet, nodding at the right times but rarely speaking, and about how I had signed where they pointed, initialed where they indicated, believing that everything was exactly as it should be. I stood up slowly and walked to the small desk in the corner of my living room where I kept my financial records, opening the drawer with a steady hand that did not quite match the unease building inside me, and I pulled out the folder labeled with the address of the house, the one I had purchased for them, the one that was supposed to represent a new beginning, and I began to go through the documents line by line, not rushing, not jumping to conclusions, just reading the way I used to when my husband and I made decisions together, carefully, deliberately. At first everything looked normal: the purchase agreement, the closing statement, the bank transfer confirmation showing the full $600,000 leaving my account, a number that still felt surreal when I saw it written in print. But then I noticed something small, something I had overlooked before, a name placement that did not align with what I thought I had agreed to, and I paused, reading it again, slower this time, making sure I was not misunderstanding, and then a third time, until there was no room left for interpretation. The property was not listed under my name, not even jointly, and for a moment I simply stared at the page, my mind not reacting with anger or panic, but with a kind of quiet clarity that settled in like a cold, steady weight. I flipped through the rest of the documents, confirming what I already suspected, and with each page the picture became more complete, more defined, until there was no longer any ambiguity about what had happened, or at least about part of it. I closed the folder gently and placed it back on the desk, not slamming it, not reacting in a way that would match the magnitude of what I had just discovered, because reactions like that come from shock, and I was no longer in shock, I was thinking. I walked back into the kitchen and rinsed my mug in the sink, watching the water swirl around the ceramic surface, and I realized that this was not a mistake, not a simple oversight or a clerical error. This was something intentional, something that required planning, coordination, and most importantly, silence. I thought about Daniel, about the boy who used to ask me for help with his homework, who used to sit at this very table and tell me about his day, and I compared that memory to the man who stood in my kitchen earlier, avoiding my eyes, asking about a nursery I had never seen, and I did not feel anger toward him, not yet. What I felt was something more complicated, a recognition that whatever role he was playing in this situation, it was not the same role he had once held in my life. And then there was Emily, composed, careful, always just slightly ahead of the conversation, and I began to understand that if there was a structure to all of this, if there was a design behind the missing pieces and the unanswered questions, then she was likely at the center of it. I dried my hands with a towel and turned off the kitchen light, leaving the house in a soft, dim quiet, and as I walked upstairs I made a decision, not out of impulse, not out of emotion, but out of a calm, deliberate understanding of what needed to happen next, because if there was something being hidden from me, something that had already cost me more than money, then the only way forward was not confrontation. Not yet, but observation, patience, and the kind of attention to detail that does not miss anything twice. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind had already begun working through possibilities before I even opened my eyes, and as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I realized that the quiet I had always found comforting in this house now felt different, not empty, but watchful, as if it were waiting to see what I would do next. I got out of bed slowly, moving through my routine with the same steady rhythm I had kept for years, making coffee, opening the blinds, letting the pale morning light settle across the kitchen floor. But beneath those familiar actions, there was a new layer of awareness, a careful attention to detail that had not been there before, and I found myself replaying every conversation I had had with Daniel and Emily, not for what was said, but for what was avoided. Later that morning, I picked up my phone and called Daniel, keeping my voice calm, even warm, the way I always had, and when he answered I could hear the slight hesitation before he spoke, a pause so brief most people would have missed it, but I did not miss it, not anymore. I told him I would like to visit the house just to see how they were settling in, to bring a few things I had picked up for the babies, small items that felt appropriate, neutral, nothing that would raise questions, and he agreed, though there was something in his tone that sounded more like obligation than enthusiasm, and he suggested the afternoon, saying, Emily had an appointment in the morning, which struck me as interesting because in the past 2 months, I had never once heard a specific detail about any appointment, not a doctor's name, not a clinic, not even a casual mention of how things were progressing. I did not comment on it, I simply said that afternoon would be fine, and when I hung up I stood there for a moment holding the phone in my hand, feeling that same quiet certainty settle in again. The kind that does not come from assumptions, but from patterns that no longer align. When I arrived at the house later that day, everything looked exactly as I remembered, the exterior neat, the driveway clean, the kind of place that suggests stability and order, and Daniel opened the door with a smile that felt practiced, not insincere, but not entirely natural either, and Emily greeted me from the living room, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, as if nothing at all had shifted beneath the surface. I stepped inside, taking in the space slowly. Not rushing, not asking direct questions, just observing, the way one does when they are trying to understand something without disturbing it. And I noticed that while the house was fully furnished, thoughtfully arranged even, there was no sign of what Daniel had mentioned the day before. No indication of a nursery, no crib, no boxes of baby items, no soft colors or careful preparations, just a spare room down the hall with a closed door. I set the small bag I had brought on the kitchen counter, and commented lightly on how nice everything looked, how well they had settled in, and Emily smiled, thanking me in a tone that was polite, appropriate, but lacking the warmth I would have expected given what I had done for them, and as we spoke, I watched her carefully, noticing how she kept her hands folded in front of her, how she did not once rest them on her stomach the way she had before, how there was a subtle distance in the way she carried herself, as if the role she had been playing required less effort now that certain assumptions had already been accepted. After a few minutes, I turned to Daniel and asked in the same calm, conversational tone, if I could see the nursery they had set up, and for a brief moment, just a fraction of a second, the room seemed to still, Daniel's expression tightening ever so slightly before he glanced toward the hallway, and Emily's eyes followed, then returned to me with a smile that felt just a touch too measured. "We are still working on it," she said, her voice smooth, controlled, and I nodded as if that made perfect sense, even though nothing in the house suggested any ongoing preparation, not a single item, not even something as small as a package or a folded blanket. I walked a few steps toward the hallway anyway, not with urgency, not with confrontation, just with quiet intention, and when I reached the door of that spare room, I rested my hand lightly on the handle, pausing just long enough to feel the tension behind me, the unspoken awareness that this was not just a casual visit anymore. And then I turned the handle and opened the door. The room was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no decorations, no signs of use at all, just clean walls and a bare floor, and I stood there for a moment taking it in, not reacting, not turning back immediately, just allowing the silence to settle around that space the same way it had settled in my kitchen the day before. And in that silence, the difference between what I had been told and what was actually in front of me became impossible to ignore, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so simple, so clear. And as I closed the door gently and turned back toward them, I realized that whatever story had been constructed over the past 2 months, it was beginning to come apart, not with noise, not with conflict, but with the quiet, undeniable weight of what was no longer there. I did not confront them, not then, not standing in that quiet hallway with the empty room behind me and their expectations hanging in the air. Instead I smiled, the same calm, polite smile I had worn my entire life in moments when something did not feel right but did not yet need to be said. And I walked back into the living room as if nothing at all had shifted, as if the absence of that nursery was not the loudest truth in the house. "It is a beautiful space," I said gently, setting my purse down on the arm of the couch, and Daniel nodded quickly, too quickly, agreeing with me in a tone that sounded more relieved than genuine, while Emily simply watched me, her expression composed, her posture still, but there was something different now, something more attentive, as if she were trying to measure how much I had understood without asking a single question. We sat together for a while after that, making small conversation that moved carefully around anything of substance, talking about the neighborhood, about the weather, about things that required no honesty, and I listened more than I spoke, noticing how often Daniel glanced at Emily before answering even the simplest questions, how their rhythm was not one of natural ease but of quiet coordination, and the more I observed, the clearer it became that whatever had been planned had not been spontaneous, it had been practiced. When I finally stood to leave, I told them I would stop by again soon, that I was looking forward to seeing how everything came together, And Emily smiled at that, a soft, agreeable smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and Daniel walked me to the door, his hand resting briefly on the frame as if he needed something solid to hold on to, and for a moment just before I stepped outside, he looked at me in a way that reminded me of the boy he used to be, uncertain, searching, but that moment passed quickly, replaced again by the version of him that had learned to stay quiet. The drive home was uneventful, the roads familiar, the traffic light, but my thoughts were anything but idle. They moved steadily, connecting details, aligning patterns, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, I was no longer questioning whether something was wrong. I was beginning to understand how it had been done. That evening I returned to my desk, opening the same folder again, but this time I was not simply reading. I was analyzing, looking beyond the surface of each document, paying attention to dates, to signatures, to the sequence of events, and I noticed how everything had been arranged in a way that appeared seamless at first glance, but upon closer inspection revealed a structure that depended heavily on my absence from key decisions, how the ownership had been assigned, how the communication had been filtered, how each step had been guided just enough to keep me involved financially while excluding me legally. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my call history, my messages, looking for any record that might fill in the gaps, and what stood out was not what I found, but what I did not find: no confirmations from medical offices, no shared updates, no casual messages about appointments or progress, nothing that would normally accompany something as significant as what I had been told. And that absence, once noticed, was impossible to ignore. The next morning I made a call, not to Daniel, not to Emily, but to someone who had known me long before any of this began, someone who had worked with my husband and me for years, our attorney, Mr. Harrison Blake, and when he answered, his voice steady and familiar, I explained that I needed to review a recent property transaction, that I wanted to make sure everything was exactly as it should be, and he agreed without hesitation, asking me to come by his office that afternoon. Sitting in his office later that day, surrounded by the quiet order of files and documents, I handed him the folder and watched as he read through it carefully, his expression neutral, professional, and when he finally looked up, there was a pause, not dramatic, not alarming, but deliberate, the kind that signals something important without needing to say it outright. "Margaret," he said calmly, "this was structured in a way that leaves you without any ownership or control over the property." And I nodded, not surprised, not shaken, because by then I had already understood that much, but hearing it confirmed, stated clearly and without interpretation, gave the situation a kind of clarity that removed any remaining doubt. "Was this explained to you at the time?" he asked, and I shook my head gently, recalling the way the conversation had been guided, the way certain details had been passed over in favor of others. And he continued, pointing out specific elements: the absence of my name, the finality of the transfer, the lack of safeguards that would typically be advised in a situation like this. And with each point the outline of what had been done became sharper, more defined. I thanked him for his time, closing the folder with the same steady hand I had used the night before, and as I left his office, stepping out into the afternoon light, I felt something settle within me, not anger, not even disappointment, but a quiet, unwavering certainty that whatever this was, whatever story had been created around me, it was no longer something I was inside of, it was something I was now observing from the outside, and that difference changed everything. When I returned home that afternoon, I did not feel the urge to sit down or rest. Instead, I moved with a quiet sense of purpose, the kind that comes when uncertainty has been replaced with clarity, and I placed the folder back on my desk, not as something unresolved, but as something understood, something that no longer needed to be questioned but needed to be addressed. I stood there for a moment, looking at it, thinking not about what had been taken from me, but about how it had been done. Because understanding the method mattered more than reacting to the outcome, and as I replayed each step in my mind, I began to see the pattern more clearly: the careful timing, the selective information, the way trust had been used not as a bond, but as a tool. I did not call Daniel, I did not send a message, and I did not let anything in my behavior suggest that I had discovered the truth, because there is a difference between knowing something and revealing that you know it, and I had no intention of giving away that advantage. Instead, I picked up my phone and made another call, this time to my bank, requesting a full history of the transaction related to the property, asking for documentation that would show not just the transfer itself, but any associated communications, confirmations, or third-party involvement, and I kept my tone neutral, professional, the way I always had when handling financial matters, because this was not personal in that moment, it was procedural. Once that was done, I sat down and began writing, not a letter, not a confrontation, but notes, simple factual observations, dates, amounts, names, each detail placed carefully on paper so that nothing would rely on memory alone, because memory can be questioned, but documentation cannot, and as I wrote, I felt a steady sense of control returning, not over them, but over my own position within the situation. Over the next few days, I maintained the same routine I had always had. I went to the grocery store, I watered the plants, I spoke to neighbors in passing, and when Daniel called to check in, I answered with the same calm warmth he expected, asking about work, about how they were settling in, never once mentioning the documents, the empty room, or the conversation with Mr. Blake, and he seemed to relax into that normalcy, his tone easing, his words flowing more naturally, as if whatever tension had existed before was beginning to fade. And I realized that the absence of confrontation was not just preserving my advantage, it was encouraging them to lower their guard. A few days later, the documents from the bank arrived, neatly organized, each page confirming what I had already seen, but adding another layer to the picture, showing how the transfer had been initiated, who had been authorized to communicate on my behalf, and how certain steps had been completed without my direct involvement. And as I reviewed them, one detail stood out more than the others: a point of contact, a name I did not recognize, listed in connection with the transaction, someone who had facilitated communication between parties at a critical stage, and I wrote it down carefully, adding it to my growing list of details. That same afternoon I called Mr. Blake again, providing him with the new information, and asked if he could look into that name, not with urgency, not with alarm, but with the same measured approach we had always taken when something required verification. And he agreed, telling me he would follow up and get back to me. In the meantime, I made another decision, one that felt small on the surface but carried significant weight. I would visit them again, not immediately, not in a way that would seem sudden or suspicious, but soon enough to continue observing, to see if anything had changed, if any new details would emerge now that I was paying closer attention. When I arrived at their house a few days later, I brought nothing with me this time, no gifts, no items for a nursery that did not exist, just myself, and I was greeted with the same polite warmth, the same careful composure, but I noticed something different, something subtle: the way Emily seemed slightly more attentive to my reactions, the way Daniel spoke a little more than usual, filling the space with conversation that did not quite connect, and I understood that while they might not know what I knew, they were beginning to sense that something was not entirely as it had been before. We sat together again, talking about ordinary things, and I listened, watching, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally, because the more they spoke, the more they revealed, not through direct statements, but through inconsistencies, through small contradictions that would not have been noticeable without context. And I did not correct them, I did not question them, I simply noted each one, adding it to the structure that was forming in my mind. And as I sat there, looking at them across the room, I realized that this was no longer about a house or even about money. It was about understanding exactly who I was dealing with, and more importantly, making sure that when the time came to respond, I would do so not from a place of emotion, but from a position of complete and undeniable clarity. A few days later, Mr. Blake called me back, and his voice carried the same steady professionalism it always had, but there was a subtle weight beneath it, something measured, deliberate, and I knew before he said anything that whatever he had found was not going to simplify the situation, it was going to define it. I sat down at my desk, the folder already open in front of me, my pen resting beside it as if I had been expecting this moment, and I listened as he explained that the name I had given him was not random, not incidental, but connected to a small consulting service that had been used in several private property transactions, often acting as an intermediary, someone who coordinated paperwork, handled communications, and in some cases ensured that certain details were processed without drawing unnecessary attention. He paused briefly before continuing, choosing his words carefully, and then he added that in this particular case, the contact had been listed as working directly with Emily, not with Daniel, not with me, but with her, and I felt something settle into place with a clarity that did not need emotion to validate it. I thanked him, asked a few precise questions, and when the call ended I did not move right away. I simply sat there, letting the information integrate with everything I had already observed, everything I had already understood, and for the first time, the structure of it all was complete, not a series of suspicions, not a collection of inconsistencies, but a coherent design, intentional, coordinated, and executed with a level of care that suggested this had never been a spontaneous decision. I closed the folder and stood up. walking slowly to the window, looking out at the quiet street, where nothing appeared out of place, where life continued as it always had, and I realized that the calm outside matched the calm within me, not because nothing had happened, but because I now understood exactly what had happened. Emily had not simply gone along with something, she had led it. She had positioned herself at the center of the transaction, controlled the flow of information, and ensured that the outcome benefited her entirely, and Daniel, whether through trust, pressure, or something else, had allowed it to happen, had stood beside her rather than questioning what was being done. I did not rush to respond, I did not pick up the phone or drive over to their house, because reaction would have served no purpose at this stage. Instead, I returned to my desk and began to organize everything I had gathered, placing each document in order, aligning dates, highlighting key sections, creating a clear, undeniable record that did not rely on interpretation, only on fact. As I worked, I thought about timing, about when and how this would need to be addressed, and I understood that it could not be done casually, not in a passing conversation or a moment of frustration. It needed to be structured the same way their plan had been structured, carefully, deliberately, with every detail accounted for. Later that evening, Daniel called again, his voice lighter than it had been before, as if whatever uncertainty he had felt earlier was fading, and I answered with the same calm warmth, asking about his day, listening as he spoke about work, about routine things that carried no real significance, and then he mentioned that they were planning a small dinner the following weekend, something informal, just the three of us, and he asked if I would like to come, and I said yes without hesitation because I understood immediately that this was the moment I had been waiting for, not because it would reveal anything new but because it would provide the right setting. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a while, not thinking about what I would say but about what I would show, because words can be dismissed, questioned, redirected, but evidence presented clearly and without emotion has a different kind of impact, one that does not depend on persuasion. Over the next few days, I prepared, not outwardly, not in a way that would draw attention, but in small, precise ways, reviewing the documents again, ensuring that everything was complete, that every detail was accurate, that nothing could be challenged or misunderstood, and with each step, the sense of uncertainty that had once existed was replaced entirely by control. When the day of the dinner arrived, I dressed as I always did, nothing formal, nothing unusual, just the quiet consistency of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. And as I picked up my purse and the folder I had prepared, I paused for a moment at the door, not out of hesitation but out of recognition, because I knew that what had begun as a simple question, a small inconsistency in a conversation, had now reached a point where everything would become clear, not through confrontation, not through raised voices or accusations, but through something far more definitive, the quiet, undeniable presentation of truth. And I stepped outside, closing the door behind me with the same steady hand I had maintained from the very beginning, because this was never about reacting, it was about finishing what they had started, but on my terms. When I arrived at their house that evening, everything appeared exactly as it should have been, the lights warm, the table already set, the faint scent of dinner lingering in the air, and Daniel greeted me at the door with a smile that felt almost eager, as if he were trying to re-establish something that had begun to slip, while Emily stood just behind him, her expression composed, her posture steady, and I stepped inside with the same calm presence I had carried all week, not as a guest, not as someone uncertain, but as someone who understood exactly where she stood. We sat down together, the three of us, plates arranged neatly, glasses filled, the kind of scene that would have once felt comforting, familiar, but now carried a different weight, not heavy, not tense, but deliberate, as if each movement, each word, had been placed with care. The conversation began easily enough, Daniel talking about work, about a project that had taken more time than expected, Emily adding small comments here and there, and I listened, nodding occasionally, allowing them to settle into the rhythm they expected, because there is a certain value in letting people believe that nothing has changed. Dinner was served, and for a while we spoke about ordinary things, the kind of topics that require no real attention, and I noticed how both of them relaxed as the minutes passed, how Daniel's shoulders eased, how Emily's tone softened, as if the absence of any questions had reassured them, and I let that continue. I let the moment stretch just long enough for them to feel comfortable again. When the plates were cleared and we moved into the living room, Daniel offered coffee and I accepted, sitting down with the same quiet composure I had maintained from the beginning, placing my purse beside me on the couch, the folder inside it resting exactly where I had left it. There was a pause then, not awkward, not uncomfortable, just a natural break in the conversation, and I used it, not to interrupt, not to shift abruptly, but to introduce something small, something simple. I turned to Daniel and asked, "How is everything going with the paperwork for the house? Have you had a chance to review it all?" And he hesitated, just slightly, before answering, his words careful, measured, saying that everything was fine, that it had all been handled, and Emily nodded in agreement, her expression unchanged, but her eyes focused more closely on me now. I reached into my purse then, not quickly, not dramatically, just a steady motion, and I placed the folder on the table in front of us, my hand resting on it for a moment before opening it. And neither of them spoke, neither of them moved, but the air in the room shifted, not with tension but with awareness. I slid a single document across the table toward Daniel, the page marked clearly, the relevant section highlighted, and I said nothing at first, allowing him to read it, to see it for himself, and I watched as his expression changed, not drastically, but enough, his eyes moving more slowly across the page, his posture tightening, and then he looked up at me, not with anger, not with denial, but with something closer to confusion, as if he were only now seeing what had been in front of him all along. Emily did not reach for the document immediately, she remained still, her composure intact, but there was a subtle shift in her gaze, a calculation, a reassessment, and after a moment she leaned forward and took the paper, scanning it quickly. Her expression remaining controlled, but her silence more telling than any reaction could have been. I continued then, not raising my voice, not accusing, simply placing another document beside the first, then another, each one building on the last, each one presenting a piece of the structure they had created, and I spoke calmly, explaining what each page showed, how the ownership had been assigned, how the communication had been directed, how my role had been limited to the financial transaction while the legal control had been placed elsewhere. Daniel sat back slightly, his hand moving to his forehead as if trying to process what he was seeing, while Emily remained composed, listening, her expression unchanged, but her attention fully fixed now, no longer observing me, but evaluating the situation itself. When I finished, I did not add anything more, I did not ask questions, I did not demand explanations. I simply closed the folder and rested my hands in my lap, allowing the silence to return, because at that point there was nothing left to clarify, nothing left to reveal. Everything that needed to be understood was already on the table, and the only thing that remained was how they would respond to it. For a long moment no one spoke, the kind of silence that does not feel empty but full, as if every unspoken thought had settled into the space between us, and I watched them carefully, not waiting for an apology, not expecting an explanation, but simply observing how they chose to respond now that there was nothing left to hide. Daniel was the first to move, his hand dropping slowly from his forehead as he looked down at the documents again, then back at me, his expression uncertain, searching for something that no longer existed, perhaps a version of this conversation where things could still be explained away, but that version was gone, replaced by the quiet finality of what had already been shown. "Mom, I did not know it was set up like this," he said, his voice lower than before, less certain, and I listened without interrupting, because whether he knew or not was no longer the central question. What mattered was what had been done, not what had been understood. Emily remained still for a few seconds longer, her eyes moving across the pages one last time before she set them down with care, not abruptly, not defensively, just deliberately, and when she finally spoke, her tone was even controlled, as if she had already decided which parts of the truth to acknowledge and which to leave untouched. "It was simpler this way," she said, and there was something in that phrasing that confirmed more than any admission could have, not because of what she said, but because of what she did not say. I nodded slightly, not in agreement but in recognition, because simplicity, when used in that context, rarely refers to ease. It refers to control, to removing variables, to ensuring that outcomes are not influenced by those who might question them. Daniel looked at her then, his confusion shifting into something more focused, something that suggested he was beginning to see the situation from a different angle, and for a brief moment there was a distance between them, subtle but present, the kind that appears when understanding begins to replace assumption. I spoke then, not to challenge, not to accuse, but to clarify what no longer needed interpretation, explaining in the same calm, steady tone that the structure of the transaction had not only excluded me from ownership, but had also removed any form of protection or oversight, that every safeguard I would have normally insisted upon had been bypassed, and that this was not a matter of misunderstanding, It was a matter of design. Emily listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but her stillness more pronounced now, as if she understood that the conversation was no longer about justification, it was about consequence. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed on the documents, and I could see the shift happening in real time, the gradual alignment of details that had previously gone unquestioned, and while he did not say much, the way he read, the way he paused, the way he looked between the pages and Emily, made it clear that whatever certainty he had held before was no longer intact. I did not press further. I did not ask him to choose a side or to explain his role, because this was not a moment that required pressure, it required clarity, and clarity has a way of settling in on its own when it is presented without distortion. After a few more minutes, I reached forward and gathered the documents, placing them back into the folder with the same care I had used when presenting them, and I stood up, not abruptly, not as an exit driven by emotion, but as a natural conclusion to what had needed to be done. Daniel stood as well, instinctively, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if he were still processing everything that had just unfolded, while Emily remained seated for a second longer before rising, her posture still composed, but her attention no longer divided, fully aware now of where the situation stood. I picked up my purse and held the folder close, not protectively, but with a quiet sense of completion, and I looked at them both, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with the same steady presence I had maintained from the beginning, because by that point, there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to uncover. I wanted you to see it for yourselves, I said simply, my voice calm, measured, and I did not add anything more, because the meaning of that statement did not require elaboration. Daniel nodded slightly, his expression still unsettled, while Emily gave a small, controlled acknowledgement, and neither of them attempted to stop me as I moved toward the door. As I stepped outside, the evening air felt cool, steady, unchanged, and I paused for just a moment before walking to my car, not out of hesitation but out of recognition, because what had taken place inside that house had not been loud, it had not been dramatic, but it had been definitive, and as I drove away, I understood that whatever came next would not be shaped by assumptions or expectations, but by the quiet, undeniable truth that had already been placed exactly where it needed to be. The following morning I woke up at the same time I always did, the light coming through the window in that familiar, quiet way, and for a moment everything felt exactly as it had before, the same house, the same routine, the same steady rhythm that had carried me through years of my life, but there was a difference now, not in the world around me, but in the way I moved through it, a kind of clarity that does not come from sudden realization, but from seeing something all the way through to its end. I made my coffee, set it on the table, and sat down with the folder in front of me one last time. Not to review it again, not to search for anything new, but simply to close that chapter in a way that felt complete, and as I placed it back into the drawer, I understood that whatever had been taken from me was not the defining part of this situation. What mattered was what I had chosen not to lose, my judgment, my composure, and my ability to see things clearly even when they were presented in a different light. Later that day my phone rang, and when I saw Daniel's name on the screen I let it ring once, twice, not out of hesitation but out of intention, before answering with the same calm tone I had always used, and for a moment, he did not speak, as if he were unsure how to begin, and then he said my name quietly without the usual ease, and I listened. He spoke carefully, explaining that he had spent the night going over the documents again, that he had asked questions, that he had realized things he should have understood earlier, and there was a weight in his voice that had not been there before, not dramatic, not emotional but real, and I did not interrupt him, I did not guide him, I allowed him to arrive at his own understanding, because anything else would have taken that from him. When he finished there was a pause, and I could sense that he was waiting, not just for a response but for something more, something that would tell him where we stood now, and I answered simply, not with judgment, not with reassurance but with clarity, explaining that the situation was not about a single decision, it was about a series of choices that had been made without consideration for what they meant, and that moving forward would depend not on what was said in that moment but on what was done next. He acknowledged that, his voice steadying slightly, and then he told me that he intended to correct it, that he would speak with Mr. Blake, that he would ensure that the ownership was restructured properly, and I listened not because I needed to be convinced, but because I needed to hear whether his words carried the same understanding his tone suggested. And when he finished I said that I would expect everything to be handled through the proper channels, that clarity and accountability were not optional, they were necessary, and he agreed without hesitation. After the call ended, I did not feel relief, I did not feel satisfaction. I felt something quieter, something more grounded, the sense that the situation had moved from uncertainty into resolution, not because everything had been fixed, but because it was now being addressed with the level of seriousness it required. Over the next few days, communication remained minimal, structured, and precise, updates coming through Mr. Blake, documents being reviewed, adjustments being made, each step documented, each detail accounted for, and I stayed informed without inserting myself unnecessarily, because there is a difference between involvement and control, and I had no need for the latter. When the final documents arrived, confirming that the ownership had been corrected, that my position had been restored in a way that reflected both the financial and legal reality of the transaction, I reviewed them carefully, not out of doubt but out of habit, and when everything aligned, I signed where necessary, completing the process with the same steady hand I had maintained from the beginning. I did not visit the house again right away. I did not feel the need to return to that space, because what had needed to happen there had already taken place, and distance, in that moment, felt more appropriate than presence. A week later, Daniel came by to see me, alone this time, and we sat at the same kitchen table where so many conversations had taken place over the years, and there was a different kind of quiet between us now, not uncomfortable, not distant but aware, and he spoke about what had happened not in detail, not in a way that tried to explain everything, but in a way that showed he understood enough. And I listened, not to evaluate him, not to measure his words, but simply to acknowledge that understanding had been reached. When he finished, I nodded, and I told him that trust is not something that disappears all at once, and it is not something that returns all at once either. It is something that changes shape over time depending on what is done with it, and he accepted that without argument, without resistance. After he left, I sat there for a while looking at the space around me, the same space that had held both certainty and doubt in the past weeks, and I realized that what remained was not the situation itself, but the clarity it had brought, the understanding of where I stood, of what I would accept, and of what I would not. And as I stood up and went about the rest of my day, everything felt steady again, not because nothing had happened, but because I had seen it clearly from beginning to end, and I had chosen how it would conclude.